This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode I chat with masters of horror about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Now today's guest is John Niven, the author of books such as Kill Your Friends, The Amateurs, and The Fuck It List, and the screenwriter of a number of films, including one of my favorites in recent years, The Trip. Now, John is an author whose fiction is not easy to classify because he neither neatly fits into the genre or literary writer box. But what he is a writer with an acerbic wit, a master of satire, and an equal to the likes of people such as Chuck Palahniuk, Martin Amis, and Bret Easton Ellis when it comes to delivering social commentary. Now, we had a fascinating conversation in which we discussed his beginnings in A&R, his forthcoming releases, and a multitude of other topics. But before we get to that conversation, it is time for a quick advert break.
From the host of This Is Horror Podcast comes a dark thriller of obsession, paranoia, and voyeurism. After relocating to a small coastal town, Brian discovers a hole that gazes into his neighbor's bedroom. Every night she dances and he peeps. Same song, same time, same wild and mesmerizing dance. But soon Brian suspects he's not the only one watching, and she's not the only one being watched. Their watching is The Wicker Man meets Body Double with a splash of Suspiria. They're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella is available from thisishorror.co.uk, Amazon, and wherever good books are sold.
It was as if the video had unzipped my skin, slunk inside my tapered flesh, and become one with me.
From the creator of This Is Horror comes a new nightmare for the digital age, The Girl in the Video by Michael David Wilson. After a teacher receives a weirdly arousing video, his life descends into paranoia and obsession. More videos follow, each containing information no stranger could possibly know. But who's sending them, and what do they want? The answers may destroy everything and everyone he loves. The Girl in the Video is The Ring meets Fatal Attraction for the iPhone generation. Available now in paperback, ebook, and audio.
Okay, well, with that said, let us not delay. It is John Niven on This Is Horror. John, welcome to This Is Horror.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is an absolute pleasure. You are one of my favorite writers, so I am honored to get you on the show. And I mean, to begin with, I wanted to know what early life lessons you learnt growing up, and they don't necessarily have to pertain to writing, but anything that you learnt in your formative years.
Gosh, life, that's quite grand, isn't it? I don't know that these things become apparent till you're older. Life lessons. That's such a big question. What life lessons did I learn when I was young? Well, my father died, I suppose, when I was relatively young. I was only 26. And like a lot of people who lose a parent relatively young, it's a bit of a starting gun going off for you, sort of telling you that life is short-ish and that you should crack on and try and do the things you want to do. And I'd kind of, when I look back now, I think to a degree, without getting grandiose, you're either born a writer or you're not. You're born with certain instincts baked in, and I had kind of, I think, wanted to be a writer since I was very young. And I'd sort of put off fully engaging with it, I think, because it seemed inevitable that you would fail. And I think that in a few years after my dad died, I got a bit more serious about that. I think I was sort of turning 30ish by the time I really committed to doing it properly. And I think it was maybe something to do with the less of the takeaway from, I mean, my father was maybe 68 when he died. So I just kind of voice sort of saying, "You better crack on and try and do this." Um, that was the one of the bigger life lessons, I guess, of my 20s. But I guess you were asking my formative years. Yeesh. I don't know. When I was younger, I was pretty stupid up until my early 30s.
Right, yeah. Well, I think a lot of us were. I think that's, you kind of learn your lessons through doing dumb shit and making a load of mistakes. And hopefully, as you get older, you make a few less mistakes or they're less severe, although doesn't always pan out that way.
No, I'm still fully capable of being very stupid today. Um, but you're when I was working in the music industry when I was in my 20s, it was a pretty hedonistic time. Uh, then when I started writing, I sort of quite quickly learned that I couldn't do it with a hangover.
Right.
I think because you're trying to like dream a whole world into being, you're trying to create something out of nothing, and that requires quite a big level of self-confidence and self-belief. And the kind of hangovers you start getting once you get into your 30s sort of prohibit that, because you're sort of crippled with self-loathing and doubt, and that's not. I suddenly found I couldn't write from that kind of place. So, by necessity of trying to become a writer, what I thought was quite late in life, in my early 30s, it felt like I'd left it quite late. I sort of began living a lot more sensibly than I had been in my
Mm,
late teens, my 20s. Um, so, and now I look back at that period. At the time, it was terrible because I'd sort of burned my bridges and left the music industry. I'm going back now to about 2002, 3. I'd sort of burned my bridges in the music business, and I was by no means certain that I'd succeed in writing, the great British novel, which I fondly thought I'd do within a couple of years before I ran out of money. And it sort of took 5 years in the end, and I was living very hand to mouth and off the charity of family and friends for a little while until thankfully it kind of all came good. But I look back and sometimes shudder thinking, God, it might not have come good. But that period now in the rear view mirror, I think of quite fondly because I worked very hard, and as anybody who's trying to write that first novel does, you're working very hard with absolutely no guarantee that, there's always a voice inside you saying, no one's going to care about this. What are you doing? Wasting your
mm,
time writing this bloody book that no one's going to publish, and even if they do, nobody's going to care about. You have to sort of, it's a full time job quietening that voice down.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that you always wanted to be a writer. And of course, you studied English literature at the University of Glasgow. You were
hmm
reading the likes of Martin Amis from a young age. So I'm just wondering, how did you land a job in A&R and the music business? Because it almost seems like a sideways move from
But
someone who was
yeah,
always interested yeah, in literature and writing.
it was a kind of diversion, yes. But I'd always loved music too. And so I made my first couple attempts at writing when I was an undergraduate, like short stories and the like, as many an undergraduate before and after me has. But I'd been in bands since I was a teenager, and I loved music and playing guitar. And the band I was in got a sort of indie record deal, and we were on tour. This is now the sort of late 80s I'm talking about. And I took a couple of years out of university where I moved to London, and we're trying to make a go of the band. Um, and then it became apparent that wasn't going to happen, and we were really, really poor. I remember being at the London Marathon in, I think, 1989, and between four of us, we didn't have enough money to buy one ice cream. And I remember thinking, "Whoa, this is a pretty hard way of life right here." And I wound up going back to finish my degree. And then after I graduated, so because I had 2 years out, by the time I graduated, I guess I was 23, 24, and um, I had been broke for as long as I could remember, because I was a student, and then I was in an indie band, and then I was a student again. And so when you got to the early 90s when I was graduating, um, I was kind of desperate to earn some money. I was both lazy and greedy, but I got a first in literature, so I got interviews at the Milk Round with like merchant banks and places like that. I remember having interviews with like Credit Suisse and Solomon
Mm.
Brothers, Lehman Brothers, and people like that. And of course, these are all huge salaries you got to start at these places. However, it became apparent you had to be in work at like 6 a.m. and you'd be there till like 9 o'clock at night. And I remember thinking, yeah, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah,
So it was,
yeah.
as I said, I was quite lazy, but yet I was also greedy, and wanted to make lots of money. So the music industry is somewhere that welcomes lazy, greedy people with open arms. So it seemed like A&R was somewhere where you could roll into the office at lunchtime, but if you were successful, you could make a lot of money. So I just graduated. Oh God, this is getting really specific, but my cousin, Kevin, like the Undertones song, I literally had a cousin called Kevin.
Right.
He ran a record shop in Glasgow in the early 90s, and it was at the height of the sort of British dance music boom, where there were hundreds of thousands of kids going clubbing every weekend and buying records and wanting to be DJs. And when a little indie dance label could put out a 12-inch single and sell like 10, 15,000 copies easily, I mean, the sorts of numbers that would put you in the top 10 today. And Kevin wanted to set up a record label as well as a shop. And he said, well, you've been in the band and you had a record deal. You know how that stuff works, don't you? Like manufacturing records and distribution. And I didn't at all. So obviously when I was in the band, I kind of thought it was Keith Richards and I didn't have to get involved with that stuff. But I wanted a job, so I lied to Kevin and said, yeah, I kind of know how that works. And so the next thing I knew, we'd sort of set up this little indie label in Glasgow in 1991 too, this is. And we did very well. We did a run of releasing some really good singles that did quite well. And you went to conventions and, conferences, and I started to meet people from major labels. And then within a couple of years, somebody at London Records offered me a job there in A&R. This would be 1994 at this point. And so I moved to London again for the second time, the first time being with the band a few years previously. I moved down again at just as sort of what we now call Britpop was beginning to explode. It was 94, it was all the rise of Oasis and Parklife and all that malarkey. And so suddenly the kind of background I came from of indie guitar music had gone from being a, quiet backwater to moving into the mainstream. So it was quite exciting in that way, and I had a lot of connections in that world. So, what to cut a long story short, what wound up happening was I sort of stumbled pretty much at university, within a couple of years into a major label A&R job where you were ludicrously well paid and you had a big expense account and company car and travel, and it was pretty seductive lifestyle. So bubbling away all the time, I made a couple of other attempts during this period to write a novel again. I think 1989, at the end of the band, before I resumed my degree, I got about 100 pages into a novel, which, looking back now, it was very violent, sort of American Psycho type novel,
Mm.
which I would have been writing actually at the same time as British Nellis was writing American Psycho. It would have been 89. But I just didn't have the self-discipline at that age, when I guess I was 21, 22. I didn't have the self-discipline that you need to finish a project. Um, I wouldn't have that until I was older, in my early 30s, to be honest. I remember reading a quote of Debbie Harry's in the book Making Tracks, The Rise of Blondie, where she said she had a lot of the same creative impulses in her late teens and early 20s as the ones that eventually made her successful, but she didn't have the sort of self-discipline to harness them
Mm.
until she was near 30. And it was certainly similar for me. I had a lot of the same. I could probably have turned a turn of phrase in terms of prose in my early 20s as I did as I could 10 years later when I started writing seriously. But I just didn't have the self-discipline to shut the door behind you for 5 or 6 hours every day that it takes to get a novel written. And so I never finished anything, which is a common problem when you talk to people who want to be writers.
Mhm.
You need to somehow get to the finish line and then go back to page one. And my least favorite part of the whole process is rereading the first draft, because
Right,
it's
yeah.
just well, my own fault. I know that I'm sure there's some writers whose first drafts you could probably take to the printers, but my first drafts are always such a mess. And it's just a case of the second drafts where the real work takes place. But yeah, it took me until I was, probably 32, 33, till I was able to do that.
So then was the first book that you finished Music from Big Pink, or the order in which they were published, was that not necessarily the order in which they were written?
Gosh, that's a good question. No, it was the first one I finished properly. I'd sort of made a stab at the novel that would become Kill Your Friends
Mm,
before Music from Big Pink, but I just couldn't get it to work. I was writing the book at that time, the version of Kill Your Friends I was writing. For a start, it was called Unrecouped, which is a music industry term for a band's debt, their outstanding
mm,
balance, if you will. And I rather grandly imagined that it referred obliquely to the lead character's soul. Um, and the book was written in the third person, and it was just a bit sanctimonious. It was a bit of a Candide type story about, a young, decent, innocent lad who goes into the music business and becomes corrupted. And it really stank. It was just so preachy and sanctimonious. And so I put it to one side when I had the idea for Music from Big Pink. And because it was a novella, it was only going to be about 35, 40,000 words. It seemed more manageable. And I thought, and I was all this time, of course, like anyone at that stage of their career, I was trying to get an agent. And once I had a publisher for Big Pink, and it was an indie publisher in America, Continuum Books, and they weren't, it was a tiny advance. I think it was like $3,000, $4,000.
mm.
But I kind of thought, well, you never know. Maybe if it comes out and it gets some good reviews, that might help me get an agent, which was in fact what happened. We got a fantastic review in the New York Times, and then I got my first agent off the back of that. And she said to me, "So what are you working on next?" And I said, "Well, this book, Kill Your Friends," but it's not really working. And I sort of went back to the drawing board. And the thing I did that made a seismic difference when I attempted the novel the second time was I decided to write it in the first person.
Mm,
And in the first person from the point of view of the character who was the antagonist in the original draft, the kind of rather than from the point of view of somebody who's decent and becomes corrupted, I wrote it from the first person point of view of the corrupted guy, the guy who was in the belly of the beast and who absolutely loved it there and was completely unapologetic about all the terrible things they thought and said and did. And as soon as I made that decision, the book just started to fly. It just had a whole other gear. And I wrote that. I guess Music from Big Pink came out in 2005. So for the rest of 2005 and early 2006, I was working on Kill Your Friends, and then I delivered it to my agent maybe the summer of 2006, and we went back and forth on a few edits and rewrites, and then we got our two-book offer from first it was turned down, of course, by I think 18, 19 publishers.
right.
Um, uh, and it was getting pretty desperate because I was just about to turn 40, and I'd sort of promised my girlfriend that if I don't have a publishing deal, if I'm not made it, if you will, by 40, I'll go off and do teacher training or something. The
Yeah.
prospect of which was filling me with, if anyone who knows me would tell you, I'm not really cut out for anything that involves patience or tolerance. So anyway, I think it was just after my 40th birthday that we got the deal with Random House, William Heinemann. And
Mm,
then came out the following year, and lo and behold, did very well. So, and here we are, nearly 20 years on. So it's still earning a crust at it. But yeah, it's a period I look back on quite fondly now, but it didn't feel that way at the time.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, I've just finished. Well, I say I'm almost finished writing a memoir that I've been working on for the last 3 years, which is about my brother and I.
Mm.
And as part of doing that, I found myself digging out some old diaries. And I don't know if you're aware. There's an old saying that only virgins and generals should keep diaries. The
Right.
notion being that either people who have done nothing at all with their lives and have all the loads of time in their hands, or people who have done lots of stuff and have lots to recap should do that. But I found that my diaries from the period sort of I was just talking about 2002, 3 through to about 2007, 8, and what you might term the failure years. I've got quite extensive diaries for all those years. Because, of course, as soon as my career takes off and you start to get busy, you don't have time to keep a bloody diary.
Yeah. Yeah.
But back then, when I had nothing else going on, I kept quite a thorough diary. And it's all just there's so much anxiety in those pages about money, about the future, about the stuff I'm working on. Is it going to work out? And you kind of wish you could go back 20 years and hold my own hand and say,
Mm.
calm down.
Yeah.
It's not that bad. You're doing better than you think.
Mm.
At the time, it was pretty scary.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I guess I felt, it really, by that time, it really was a last roll of the dice. I sort of thought, I don't know, what am I going to do if this doesn't work out?
Mm.
Um, well, funnily enough, that I talk about this in the memoir, because I guess be the mid noughties, about 2005, maybe just before Big Pink came out, I was really despairing about what am I going to do. Well, when I was a kid, my father had been in the RAF in the Second World War. He really wanted to be a pilot, but couldn't be because he was colourblind. So he wound up being a mechanic on aircraft. But he actually applied to be a tail end Charlie, like the rear gunner on heavy bombers, who had like a 1 in 10 survival rate or something. They'd often just have to get hosed out of the cockpit after a Messerschmitt or whatever had snuck up in them. So he was desperate to fly, my dad. So when I was a kid, I really wanted to be a pilot. And up until I discovered, well, this all went out the window when I discovered punk rock when I was about 13. But up until that age, I thought I was going to be a pilot in the RAF. And so fast forward sort of 20 odd years, and I'm sitting despairing one day about what I'm going to do for my future, because I had a son by then who I couldn't really
Mm.
help support at the time. And I thought, I know, I was just on the internet, and the early days of the internet, and I found the RAF's website, and I just clicked on officers, and it said, to get into officer training, you need a university degree or equivalent. I thought, right, I've got that. And it said the upper age limit is 39. And I think at the time I was something like 36, 37. So I thought,
Mm.
oh yeah, still get in there. And so I wound up one day getting the train into Tottenham Court Road, and I found myself in the RAF recruiting office filling in a form for officer training. And then I had this sort of out of body experience where I sort of looked down at myself and thought, what the fuck are you doing? And I literally just sort of ran out of there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it was a kind of wake up moment where I thought, right, okay, if we're not going to join the RAF, so we really need to make this writing thing work. So we got to give it absolutely everything. And I think, but I was working at that point from like 9 in the morning till 9 at night, just writing, just
Mm.
trying to get better. And thankfully we got there in the end. We're not. I'm not speaking to you from an RAF base somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you were talking before about originally just not being able to finish things, and I think that is an incredibly kind of common complaint from people starting out as writers. But it sounds like, in terms of what the impetus was, it was just absolute fear and desperation. It was, not
Yeah, there was
going into teacher training and stuff like that.
there was, there was a lot of. And by the way, no disparagement there to anyone who is a teacher who's um, uh, but there was a lot of fear and desperation flying about at that time,
Mm.
for sure. But a lot of times when you meet people who want to be writers or are starting out, um, I often tell them about the pyramid. So if you picture a pyramid, at the very top of it, there's a tiny dot that's occupied by Joe Rowling and Stephen King and
Mm,
Dan, people like that who sell tens of millions of books. Below that, there's another very small strata occupied by writers who make a very good living. I think the stats are something like 10% of published writers account for 70 or 80% of the income. So
mm,
somebody like myself's probably in that band. Below that, you've got another chunk, and this is still quite a small band of people who make a modest living from writing, maybe equivalent to say what a teacher earns. Then below
mm,
that, you get people who make some money from writing, but they kind of have to do another job, really. Below that, there's quite a big band of people who um, have written novels that remain unpublished. Below that, there's people who are writing things. This is a pretty big band now, who are writing things that they'll never finish.
mm,
And below that, there's people who talk about writing a novel. So when you meet people, you meet millions of people. Yeah, I'm thinking about writing a book. I might write a book, and they toss it off as if it's really, I might get some milk later or a paper. I
yeah,
always look at people with just amazement and like at the arrogance.
yeah,
And then sometimes what a guy said to me, I was, yeah, I'm going to write a book, and I was like, oh, yeah, good luck with that. And he said, John, when you write an novel, do you work out in advance what's going to happen? I went, yeah, to a degree. It tends it helps to not completely, not every moment of it, but yeah, I have a bit of a roadmap. And you can see this guy going, oh, right, interesting. It reminds me of the bit in The Simpsons where they go to Itchy and Scratchy World, and one of the robots takes the top of its head off. You can see all these wires and machinery. And Marge says to Homer, see, Homer, that's why your robot didn't work. But yeah, your
yeah,
robots get a better chance of working if you actually have some wiring. So if you want to talk about writing a book, you're probably not going to do it. The next stage up the pyramid is people who are writing stuff and never get it finished, which I was in for a good few years. And then if you can just finish what you're writing, this is what I'll tell people. If you can just finish something, you're going to jump into the next strata of the pyramid where you're getting much nearer the top than you think,
mm,
just because you've finished something. And then with the luck and the wind behind you, you never know, you might get it published, and then, you're at least buying a ticket to the lottery at that point.
right, yeah,
Any good. But just finishing something moves you from in the bottom strata of that pyramid, there are hundreds of millions of people who talk about writing a book who never do it. And then there's tens of millions who try to write something, never finish it. If you can just get yourself up into the narrower band of people who actually finish something, that's quite an achievement. Yeah. It might be garbage, but you've at least finished your garbage.
right, yeah, yeah, and it's so interesting the amount of people, who you'll meet and you'll say, "I'm a writer," and they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I think I'll write a book one day." And if you introduced yourself as an electrician, they wouldn't say, "Oh, well, I think I might do a little bit of that one day."
Could
Or
you come
like
and rewire my house?
Beethoven, did people say to him, "Oh yeah, I might knock off a little symphony in a
Fuck
weekend?"
over stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, guess it's because writing has a dual capability, isn't it? We can all write to some extent, whether it's a letter for the bin man or a note for the wife. Everybody can write. So people kind of, when you if you review a symphony, you don't write a symphony in response. You write a prose review. So
Mm,
prose is something that many people feel they have a sort of competency in.
mm,
And you read a lot of criticism of novelists, written by people who clearly wish they could write novels themselves.
yeah.
Some of the, sometimes when I've received a really bad review for something I've done, I often think it's a fair bet that that person has 4 or 5 unpublished novels and a bunch of unproduced screenplays in the desk drawer. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong, I think good criticism, when it's done well and written well, is art form in itself.
Mm.
But a lot of the time, I think Martin Amis said that envy and bitterness never come to the ball dressed as envy and bitterness. They come dressed as high-minded artistic outrage, or
Mm.
whatever the review is dressed up as.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like the turning point in terms of Kill Your Friends was writing it from the perspective of Stephen Stilfox. And I
Yeah,
mean, like a lot of antagonists, I mean, like John Self, like Patrick Bateman, there's just something deliciously infective in terms of just how much of an asshole, Stephen Stilfox is. And there's just so many great one-liners, and I'm wondering, did Stephen Stilfox kind of just come to you as was, or was this something that?
there were two or three, as with real people on their own and are really good enough for a literary character, you need to take bits from a few different people and put them together like a sort of Frankenstein. So his hedonism kind of came from one guy I used to work with. His sort of cynicism and a sharp tongue came from another one. A guy who I was actually with in Los Angeles last week, bumped
Mm,
into in the hotel in the bar.
yeah.
He was out there in business. And we're still friends, 30 years later. And he knows that the character was partly based on him. And I think he quite likes it secretly. So we were sort of catching up. But yeah, I had this sort of rule that anything that I'd heard sort of behind closed doors in the music business, no matter how outrageous or vicious, and music industry executives tend to say really outrageous, vicious things about the artists they work with, especially if it's not going well. That I had a rule that if I'd heard it in a private moment, then the character could say it or think it.
Mm,
Um, and so that gave a pretty wide remit to some of the things Stephen Stilfox was allowed to say and think. I mean, funnily enough, I don't know if you get the novel published today, considering the sort of levels of sexism,
mm,
homophobia, misogyny, and racism. I don't know that you'd have an easy time getting a book like that published now than it was the case 15 years ago.
mm,
Um, so in that sense, I guess we're quite fortunate with our timing. So yeah, but once I sort of allowed the character to talk in an unfettered way, like I said earlier, the book just kind of started to write itself. It just flew. Um, and then, as I said, when it was published, to some acclaim and success, I think because I was just turning 40, I thought, right, I've got my foot in the door. I can't let up. So I think, what year would that be? So, and then in the sort of 12 years or so that followed, I published 10 novels. Um, I kind of think that's quite common. You think you get your foot in the door and somebody's giving you a chance that you're not gonna let it slide.
mm,
I mean, to me, I mean, you get the crime guys like Ian Rankin publishes a book a year, pretty much.
mm,
Um, that always astonishes me. I'm not, Then on the other hand of that, you've got the literary dudes, like say your Donna Tartts, who publish a novel every 10 years or 5 years, maybe. I
mm,
always think. I think Stephen King said he always thinks, "What are you doing with your time? What do you do?" If you sit down at the desk every morning, you're going to get 1,000 words or so, and on that
mm,
basis, you're going to even with a lot of rewriting, you'll produce a novel every couple of years. So, which tends to be my MO. It's like every other year I'll publish a novel. Um, so yeah, to me, you don't work as hard as the genre guys, but I probably work a bit harder than the inverted commas literary novelist
right,
because
right,
it's the party once every 5 years.
yeah,
But then, of course,
yeah,
as you become successful, there become other demands on your
mm,
time. Like whether it's doing things like this or whether it's journalism or in my own case, screenwriting became
yeah,
an
yeah,
increasingly dominant part of my writing.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, you said that it might be difficult to get Kill Your Friends published today. And I wonder, so when you revisited that world for Kill 'Em All, were there kind of concerns, or did you have to kind of rein anything back? I mean, certainly as a reader, it didn't seem like, particularly with Narnia, it's like maybe you doubled down rather than reining anything back.
Yeah,
But
no, I don't think we did. But again, that came out in the middle of sort of 2018. It
mm,
came out just before the whole Me Too thing really kicked off.
mm,
Um, I, I think even 5 years ago, we weren't quite where we are now. you know.
Mm,
You could go maybe away. I think. I mean, I wouldn't. You know. You know, I've been fairly. I want to be cautious saying that like, oh, you're cancelled and you can't do this because I've pretty much been able to write whatever I like. But
mm,
I think maybe with today, if you're looking for a deal with younger editors, it might be, you know, a different kettle of fish. I'm the same editor at Random House for 15 years, and we're both of a
mm,
similar age group, you know. But no, okay, you know, you make a fair point. No, Kill 'Em All was pretty much as unrestrained as the original
mm,
book, you know. And I had vague plans for a third volume, to be written around 2028, which is what that 5-6 years away.
mm.
With Stealth Fox's entrance into politics, which
Oh,
I kind of
yes.
mooted, but because by that in the original book he was 27, and then the sequel was set 20 years after it, so he was 47. So I guess in the
Mm,
next one, 57. Um, so we'll see. We'll see. I do like, you know, there's a lot of novelists over the years, whether it's Philip Roth or John Updike, have used that device of coming back to the same character every 10 years or so and using them as a sort of lens through which to have a look at the times you're living in at that point.
mm,
So you know, that was the other thing when I was writing this. When I was writing Kill 'Em All, it was at the height of sort of Trump mania and Brexit.
yeah, yeah.
I was just increasingly thinking, oh my god, it literally is Stephen Stilfox's time now. The whole notion of populism is very
Mm,
close to how we saw A&R, you know. Um, as long as your concept would fly with millions of morons, whether it was a
mm,
political concept or a novelty record, then that was all good in his book, you know.
mm,
Uh, as he helped you achieve money and power and success, it was who cares. So yeah, it felt very apposite to bring Stephen back at that point. So who knows who will be come 2028? Might not even be here. Old Putin might push the button, and we'll be, you know, we'll be rooting about in the ruins for like half a piece of raw sheep to
yeah,
eat. You know, literature might be pretty far from our concerns.
yeah, yeah. Well, I certainly hope that this third book will turn up. I mean, yeah, I only got to wait 5 or 6 years now, so yeah, really
Yeah, it's
anticipated. But yeah,
which
it
is
the trajectory, I mean, him going into politics, it makes sense. And, particularly with the rise of the celebrity in inverted commas joining the political conversation. So, yeah, intrigued to see
yeah.
what Stealth Fox does.
Well, he'll be in his 50s at that point, and he's sort of rich beyond God. So he, you know, no, he doesn't need to make any more money. It's like, although he's probably still very interested in that. And what better way than politics, you know, where he's likely doing all sorts of shady arms deals and God knows what. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see if that book ever happens. I don't know. I haven't fully committed to it, but it might be fun.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's interesting, of course, you talk about in Kill 'Em All, this was the time of Trump and Brexit. And I mean, almost a parallel in terms of exploring Trumpism, but in the future is, I think, your latest book to date, The Fuck It List. But that kind of has a different take on it. That's more futuristic. And I would say Frank Brill is certainly more restrained with his thoughts and commentary on the world compared to Stephen Stilfox. But, apart from Kennedy Marr, is there anyone who's been, more kind of upfront than Stilfox?
Kennedy Marr again. Yeah, go back to Straight White Male. That was 10 years ago. Yeah, Kennedy's pretty forthright. Frank Brill that you mentioned in the Fuck It List. I mean, Frank's more of an everyman than any of
Mm,
those characters.
yeah,
They're a
yeah.
bit They're quite extreme, larger than life characters. With Frank, it was important for that book to work that he be the kind of guy who could have, and indeed did, vote for Trump. You know, the kind of, you know, moderate middle ground guy, um, who was like not seduced, but just kind of thought, well, this might be worth a try. It might be a fresh line of thinking, a new way of doing things. It might be worth a pop. There's no idea what the repercussions were going to be. And of course, the big repercussion for Frank in the bucket list is the overturning of Roe Wade, which leads to his daughter dying. And of course, that then became reality. I wrote that novel in 2019, and I guess the whole Roe Wade thing happened the last year or so, didn't it? So it was a sort of frighteningly prescient in that sense. So I was making some bold swings in that book with stuff that I didn't necessarily. I thought, nah, sure, they're not nuts enough they'll ever try and overturn that. And yet, lo and behold, there we were. It's a shocking reminder of just how conservative some of America is, how reactionary. That would be, forget the bucket list, it would be the Handmaid's Tale if they were given their leeway. So yeah, that book. I guess that novel's a slight anomaly for me in that it was the only book I've written that was kind of very of its moment. It was kind of inspired by events that were unfolding around us as I wrote, because I had kind of been a long time Trump watcher. Well, I think it started when the fucker blocked me on Twitter. I'm going back now to November 2012, the night that Obama won his second term.
Right.
Trump had been gloating all night on Twitter that Obama was going to lose. And then he lost his mind when Obama won his second term. And Trump tweeted something like, bah humbug, back to the drawing board. And I replied to him saying, mate, you sound like a really shit Scooby-Doo villain. And in a full rage, Trump blocked me. I thought, that's quite mad. I've been blocked by Donald Trump on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, and for such a kind of minor thing as well,
Yeah.
considering this is like yeah.
And then, of course, a couple of years later, he announces he's running. And I spend quite a lot of time in LA, so I would say to my sort of, in LA, most of my friends out there are fairly of the left, liberals. I'd say, so what's going to happen with Trump? They always laugh and go, yeah, I know, he's just to say he's not actually going to run in any serious way. He's just trying to get publicity. And then the next thing, he's properly running. And I went, well, could he win? And it was like, don't be ridiculous. He's never going to get through the primaries. He's getting no chance. Then the next thing, he's won, he's the candidate. And you'd say, well, can he win the election? And they would all go, don't be so crazy. He's getting no chance. So at that point, I was thinking, well, you've been wrong every step of the way so far. I might just get down the bookies and stick some cash on the fucker winning. So I stuck a fair bit on Trump to win at fairly long odds at the time. And I was in LA, so my wife was making I was ringing Charlotte back here in England saying, look, go to Ladbrokes and stick a few more quid in Trump. Because I hate the guy more than life, but it would be some consolation if he did win. And also I was doing that thing of like a lot of sports guys do. You're betting on the team that you wanted to lose. You're trying to jinx it the other way. And then when Charlotte went to put one of the bets on at the bookmakers back here in Buckinghamshire, she said that the girl behind the counter said, "Oh yeah, you're betting on Trump. You like him, do you?" And she went, "No, not that I like him, but And the girl went, "Oh, I like him. Yeah, he speaks his mind, doesn't he?" And at that point, I went, "Right, double it. Whatever we're betting, double it." If some girl in a bookies in High Wycombe thinks that way, God knows what half of Middle America's thinking.
Right.
So sure enough, we won quite a bit of money. And what I did at that point, sorry, we're slightly getting away from writing here.
No, it's all good.
What I did at that point was we immediately took a portion of the winnings and I said, put it on a bet for impeachment, which we won as well. Because he's just a crime machine. He cannot help but crime. So the minute he gets in office, he will eventually be impeached or something. It's guaranteed. And when we won that bet, friends were going, "How did you know that?" And I went, "That wasn't the long shot. Him winning the election felt like quite a long shot at the time. But him getting impeached once he won it, that was a no-brainer. That was locked on that was going to happen."
Yeah.
So anyway, here we are. But let's hope we're not talking about having to place bets in the fucker again. Let's hope he flames out at some point soon. So yeah, so where we came out with this was I was saying that the fuck it list was quite an anomaly, and that I guess I was just so I felt like I'd been stewing in Trump for about 4 or 5 years at the point where I started writing that book, and I just wanted to exercise that demon in a way. So without any spoilers for your audience, in the climax of that book, I certainly got to work out some rage.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the premise of the fuck it list is such a simple and yet such a brilliantly executed concept. And I mean, my understanding is, like a number of great ideas, that the inspiration came from a conversation that you had with one of your mates.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, my friend Alan Carruthers, if he's listening, Alan. Alan's one of those guys who's hilariously funny because he's completely out his mind, and yet he thinks he's completely sane and normal. And we're getting to an age, I guess, we're just getting into our 50s, late 40s. Then me and my friends, and the age where you hear about friends getting cancer diagnoses and things like that. And we were talking about this in the pub one night. And Alan said, "Oh, you know what you do if you get that diagnosis, John?" And we're like, "Go and swim with the dolphins, climb Tibet or climb the Himalayas." And he went, "No, no, no, no. You've got a list of the 5 or 6 people that have really fucked you over in your life. And you turn up at the door with a shotgun, right? And ding dong, ring the bell. You open the door, you give them a minute, give them a second, and they fucking know why you're there. And then, yeehaw, blow them away." And everyone was just astonished, going, "Hang on, find out you get cancer and you're going to go on a killing spree." He's like, "Aye, would you not do that?" And I was like, Jesus Christ. So I just thought this was so funny. But this was a long time ago. This was maybe at least 5 years before I wrote the novel. But
Mm,
what happens sometimes is that you get a tiny idea. Nabokov said that the impulse to write a novel is just a vague throb. So I
mm,
found that a throb of this idea. So an idea, man gets cancer diagnosis and goes on a killing spree. And you have one idea alone is really quite enough for the novel. You need 2 or 3 that sort of wrap themselves around each other. And I'd been looking for a way to write about Trump's America. And so suddenly the idea of a sort of road trip novel with this character who's been diagnosed with cancer and is going to go and kill some people and is traveling across a future dystopian Trump America seemed very appealing. So, it was the things that become novels, it tends to be a stray thought that becomes a recurring thought that eventually becomes the only thought possible. Uh,
mm.
it's announcing that it's time to write the book. So yeah, I'll forever be very grateful to Alan for that idea. I think I sent him a copy of the book when it was in galleys, and he knows it was But now and again I've heard people complaining now and again that you've stolen their ideas, and well, you better write it first. Don't be
Yeah.
don't be don't be saying any great ideas around writers because we're just going to steal them.
Yeah.
You can't, as any lawyer will tell you, you can't copyright an idea, only the
Right.
expression of an idea. So I'll see you in court, mate. It's often my answer there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's an argument anyway that there is no such thing really as originality. It's all in the execution. So we can have like 10 or so of us come up with the idea, we do our take on it, and really it's how we wrote it. That's where it's going to
Yeah,
determine whether it is or isn't good.
yeah, you do hear, especially in the sort of screenwriting community, you hear people complaining with it, or that movie that Universal. I had a meeting there 3 years ago, and they're just doing a version of my idea. They stole it, but you know what? They probably didn't. There's probably loads of people at any one time having similar ideas. And if you've only got 1 or 2 ideas, then you're not going to get very far anyway. All the really good screenwriters I know, they churn ideas out. Because
Mm,
unlike a novel where you're kind of in the chair for a year and a half maybe, um, with a screenplay, you can, once I have the idea clear and a sort of decent outline, I can write a screenplay in 2 weeks, 2, 3 weeks. So
mm,
if you're any good, it's not the mammoth investment of your time that writing a novel is. It's 100 to 120 pages, quite a lot of blank space and dialogue and indentation. So, uh, you're better off just going and writing it than, you know. Plus, I don't, you know, I've sold a few high value specs in my time because I'd always rather
Mm,
write the script. Just to be clear for your listener, a spec is a script that you write speculatively, that you're not
mm,
hired by the studio to do. So a lot of the work I do for studio is you're hired to rewrite an existing project that they
mm,
don't think is quite work. But with a spec, I'd a lot of writers like to pitch. You know, they'll spend the whole day going around LA and having 5 or 6 pitch meetings where you go in and in a sort of 45-minute chat, you'll basically outline the idea verbally to the producers of the studio. But I just find that so tedious. I also hate writing outlines and treatments because it's like you're kind of writing a sales document,
mm.
a pitch document. I'd almost rather just go off and write the thing, you know?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think increasingly that's kind of what I like. That's what I like doing when I've got some time between projects. I might knock out a spec script.
Mm,
Um, but you know, your agents and managers don't like you doing that. They feel that you should be paid before you start work, which
right,
I
yeah,
get that.
yeah.
Yeah. I like writing. I don't like having loads of meetings.
Mm,
And plus, if you live in LA and you get into the circuit, and I know I say I haven't lived there full time, but I'll be there for 3 or 4 months at a stretch. You just see
mm,
how people get sucked into it with, you know, 3 or 4 meetings a day and a half hour to an hour in the car in between them. That's your whole day
mm.
gone. And what have you done? You've driven around LA going to a bunch of meetings. I'd rather just be in the study writing. You know,
Yeah,
I got quite a lot done in those 7 hours that devoted
yeah,
to driving about having meetings. You know, now
yeah.
and again it's now and again it's unavoidable. You're going to meet, and plus that is part of the screenwriting thing that's quite nice. Is that it does get you out of the house, and you know you meet. Often you'll have a co-writer, or you meet the producers, or the director, or the studio. Whereas when you're writing a novel, it's quite a lonely gig, you know. It's just you
Mm,
for
yeah.
long periods, which I quite like too. I think that's the other thing that I were talking earlier about when I began to realise in my early 30s that I could do this. Um, there's a certain part of a writer that's most fully alive when they're on their own. So that's quite a specific characteristic, unique to someone who's going to spend a lot of their time in a room on their own. You have to like being there in your own company,
Mm,
and in that sense. Which when I was younger, I always felt there was something better to do.
right.
I mean, and part of that's just a byproduct of being young. You know, when you're in your 20s, if you're in your pajamas on the sofa at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, you feel like the world's biggest loser. But by the time you're in
Mm.
your 40s, in your pajamas at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, you feel like you've won the lottery. And it's just, you know, you're very happy about that situation in a way that
Yeah,
you're not when you're younger, you know?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, as we've been talking a little bit about your screenwriting, I mean, I absolutely loved The Trip. And
Oh,
of
thank you.
course, yeah, of course, it's going to bring to mind the likes of Funny Games. There's also something structurally that, yeah, it's kind of akin to a Tarantino movie, but it's just so fucking bonkers, and there are so many plot twists, and it's like, well, this happened earlier. Oh, by the way, this happened before that. And fuck me, this happened before that. So, I mean, how did this project come about? How did you get involved in writing The Trip?
It was Tommy Wirkola who directed it. He had loved the script I wrote a few years back, and we kind of how did we work together at that point? Yeah, with a movie that almost began shooting back a few years earlier, and then the finance got pulled at the last minute. But Tommy and I got to know each other, and you know, really liked each other's work. And then Tommy pitched me. He said, "Look, it was the beginning of lockdown, the first serious lockdown. I guess it's been back in 2019 or 20, no 20, it's 2020, April of 2020. Tommy said, "Look, I've got an idea about a couple who go away for the weekend." And you realise they're trying to kill each other. It's not a romantic weekend. And that was all he had at that point. And so we sort of spitballed it, as they say, back and forth on the phone for a bit. And then we decided just to start writing. So what we'd do was I'd write 5 or 6 pages, a day, and then email it to Tom, and he'd write 5 or 6. And he was in LA at that point, and I was back here. So I'd get his pages in the morning, and then I'd write mine, and he'd get them when he woke up. And we just did that, and we had a draft in like 6 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks. So that was our first draft by that May. We did some
Mm.
rewriting and then sent it out in sort of June, and we got a few offers right away to make it. So yeah, the trip, as I was saying a minute ago, that was a spec script, really. But a couple of the offers from America, there was a particular scene, which if you've seen the movie, I'm sure you can imagine the scene I'm talking about, that they wanted taken out or vastly diluted. And we were like, no, no, we need that scene. So Tommy wound up saying, look, I think if we can keep the budget to 5-6 million, I could probably get this made in Norway, because Tommy's quite a big, Tommy's a bit like the Danny Boyle of Norway. So
Mm.
if I can keep the budget low enough, I'm pretty sure I can get the money in Norway to make exactly the movie we want to make. And then it'll be better. It'll be a better movie, and we'll probably sell the remake rights. And that's exactly what happened. We went off and we shot the film in Norway in September. We started shooting September 20. So for anyone who knows the business, that's astonishingly fast. To go from a first draft in April to shooting the film in September was crazy.
Yeah.
And the movie wrapped the night Joe Biden won the election, actually, in November 20. We were
Right.
all in Norway. I watched that happening in Norway. So, yeah, and then post-production into the sort of spring, early summer of 21, that came out that summer. It did really well for Netflix. So we're writing a kind of sequel at the moment. Not a direct sequel, but another sort of darkly comic thriller set in
Ah,
Norway, which Netflix Europe are producing, and which, all being well, will be shooting autumn next year. So we just finished the first. Actually, I'm flying to Oslo on Monday to have a
mm.
meeting. We just delivered the first draft to Netflix. So it's a bit bigger budget. So obviously there's going to be more voices in the mix, he said diplomatically. As they say.
Yeah.
But no, I love Tommy's great because he's a writer director, and it's really fast working with Tommy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I first became aware of him with Dead Snow, but he's blowing
Yeah,
up at the moment with Violent Night. There's a lot of buzz
yeah.
going on.
Well, I did a little dialogue polish on that movie for Tommy.
Mm.
It wasn't my idea, it wasn't my original screenplay, but I just did a little polish on the dialogue before he shot. And yeah, it opened. I think we opened to $20 million dollars last week. It was made for 20 million, so that's a fantastic start.
Yeah.
Um, and we've got a very expensive World War II movie that Tommy and I have written, which I won't get into the details of now. There's a Tarantino-ish rewriting of history element to it, but it's
Mm.
a lot of fun. It's like a $60-70 million film. So we're both right now just fingers crossed, hoping that the Violent Night continues to do well. I think then somebody might greenlight the World War II movie, which would be,
Yeah.
I guess, a project for 2024.
Yeah.
So we'll see. The wheels turn slowly, Michael.
Yeah. 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 They certainly do.
Well, which I understand. When I was younger, I was a bit more bloody Philistines at film studios. What do they know? But I get it now. Especially at the top end of the game, you're green lighting a film that's going to cost 70, $100 million.
Mm.
You're bringing this entire $100 million business into effect overnight. That is going to
Mm.
stand or fall on the opening weekend of one product.
Yeah.
It's it would give me pause for thought before I greenlit anything.
Right. Yeah.
Because you get 2 or 3 of them wrong in the bounce, you're going to be looking for a new job. Um,
Yeah.
which we shall see. We shall see. But we made Violent Night with 87 North, who we've got another project in development with. They do the
Mm.
John Wick movies. They did Nobody. They did Bullet Train, and they're very good at those sort of action movies in
Mm.
at a certain price point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm hoping that the World War II one might come off in the next year.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of exciting things going on. And I mean, I wonder these days, in terms of your writing, I mean, how much are you dividing your time between writing like the books and then writing the screenplays? What does that look like for you?
What I try to do, I try very hard to keep the mornings free for prose or whatever book I might be
Mm,
working on, from sort of 9 a.m. till lunchtime. And then in the afternoons, whatever screenplay work I've got going on. But because I've got about 3 or 4 movies and TV things I'm working on at the moment, it's sort of it's creeping into the whole day at the moment about the screenwriting. So, but I've just finished this memoir, so I've got a new novel I want to start in the new year in January. So from January, I'm
mm,
going to try and be quite strict about the first sort of at least 2 or 3 hours of every day are for the novel.
mm.
Yeah, but if you compartmentalise your time and say, right, I've got 2 hours today to do this and 2 hours on that, you can get quite a lot done in a 2 hour. I think most writers, if you give me the whole morning to get my 1,000 words, it will take the whole morning, but I can get it done in 2.5 hours of a
Yeah,
nice, very focused 2 hours.
yeah.
If I get 2 hours really concentrated work a day, I can get quite a lot done.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like if I give myself too much time, then I kind of seem to piss that time away. But if I've got an hour or I've got two, it's like, right, now it's fucking writing time.
Task expands to fill time allotted, as they say.
Yeah,
Your-
yeah,
It
that's
will
it.
it will grow to occupy as much time as you give it.
Yeah.
Sometimes not a bad thing to be concentrated.
Mm, yeah, yeah. And in terms of the new novel, is there anything you can tell us about it?
In brief, it's called The Fathers, and it's about two star-crossed men, if you will, who one of them's very sort of it's set in Glasgow, and one of them's
Mm,
a very sort of lower class Begbie type, if you will, and the other
mm,
guy's far more middle class, rarefied, gentrified, and they meet outside the maternity ward where they've both just had a kid.
mm,
And these are two guys who would never normally meet in
right.
normal life, but their sort of paths become intertwined um, with tragic, comic, hilarious, and sort of devastating results. Without giving too much plot away, that's all I'll say just now. But it's a sort of um, it's two men from very different sides of the tracks become embroiled in each other's lives,
Mm,
sort of idea. So I'm really looking, and I got it. I got maybe 10,000 words in, and then this memoir just kept dragging on. So I had to shelve it for a bit. So I'm really looking forward to getting back into it and hopefully get it finished by next summer.
yeah.
Is the plan?
No, I'm certainly very intrigued, and I mean, it occurs as we're talking, and of course, I've thought about this before, but I mean, your work is incredibly difficult to put into any genre classification or indeed to classify at all. I mean, because it's not quite horror, it's not quite crime, it's not quite thriller. There's like a little bit of everything, social commentary, satire.
Yeah, it's
Has that
it's
been
yeah, it's
problematic for you?
well, to be perfectly frank, yeah, it is because I think if you're a genre novelist, a very specific genre, then there's an audience and there's festivals and there's a marketing route for those books. If you're a literary novelist, if you're Salman Rushdie or even doing, then there's a whole other thing for that. But when you do what I do, it's difficult sometimes because you don't fit into any strict genre. There's no harder ground to occupy than the non-genre, non-literary novelist.
Mm,
So it can be tough, but I don't know how else to do it. What the ideas for books occur as they occur, and all of them
mm.
all been a bit different. Cold Hands say was a bit like a traditional thriller, and some of the novels have been more like Sunshine Cruise, probably more straight up comedy.
Yeah, and I love that novel, by the way, and it doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's
No,
so
but
good.
again,
It's
we sold the film rights to that for a lot of money, and then the movie just never happened for whatever reasons. Frustrating because I always thought if a good movie was made from that book, the novel might find its eventual audience.
yeah,
Um, yeah, it's just I've sort of come to terms with it that it's it's part of what I do. It's not easily categorized, and c'est la vie, you know. It might cost me a bigger audience, but I wouldn't know how to do it any other way. It's like when people say, John, you can write a kid's book, you can clean up, you know. I literally wouldn't know where to fucking begin. How do you write a kid's book? I mean, Jesus. I could no more fly to the moon.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing. And well, I really do hope that at some point they make a movie out of the Sunshine Cruise Company, because
Oh God,
it,
you and me both, pal.
yeah, yeah, and there's just like clearly a market for it. And it could appeal to people who like, things like The Hangover, but also I'm forgetting the name of it. There was this film about like three old men that rob a bank. I think it was Michael Caine
Yeah,
and Morgan
there's also
Freeman.
the best exotic
Yeah,
marigold hotel. That I thought it was a huge overlap for that book and
yeah.
that those sorts of audiences. But who knows? Mind you, I always put some darker bits in that maybe put that audience off. So it's
Yeah. Well, that those are my favorite parts. I do I do
oh,
like
nice.
yeah, I like what happens with the protagonist's husband, but people
Yeah,
wondering
that,
what
that was the
happens. It's like
that was the bit
you
I was sort of specifically referring to.
yeah, yeah. It's like, pick up the book and find out for yourself. But they can still make it into a film. They don't have to
Oh,
go too graphic with that.
I wrote this. I wrote the script and we elided around that moment. We didn't graphically show anything. There's ways to do it.
Yeah. No, you have to pay extra for that.
But it's been great. It's been great talking to you, Michael. Fortunately, I have to run now. But thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, yeah, this has been a tremendous pleasure, and I'd love to get you back on at some point. To talk more about your books. There's so many things I'd like to say. We haven't even spoken about The Amateurs, which is a bit of a favorite amongst hardcore Niven fans. We haven't spoke
Yeah,
about,
when you meet real fans, that is always their favourite book.
yeah,
And funnily, I have a meeting in Glasgow next week to discuss the week after next, sorry, to discuss a TV show based in it, which has been sort of rumbling along for a long time now,
mm,
but nobody's quite pulled the trigger on it yet. I guess because it's quite
yeah,
expensive to do. But
yeah,
yeah, fingers crossed that might be happening. But no, it'd be great to come back on next year when the memoir comes out in September. Might be a good idea to speak again then.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you again for chatting with me. Where can our listeners connect with you?
On Twitter, I am at Estelle Costanza, as in George Costanza's mother. It's a long story to do with losing my original account. We won't go into that now. But yeah, at Estelle Costanza on Twitter is the easiest way to get hold of me.
All right, we'll jump into that story next time we get you on. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Good night, and may your God go with you.
All right, there it is.
The old Dave Allen, the old Dave Allen favourite.
Yeah.
But thank you for having me on, Mike. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening to This Is Horror Podcast with John Niven, a wonderful writer and someone I can't wait to get back on the show. Now, coming up in the next episode is a conversation with the founder of Splatterpunk and a screenwriter of films such as The Crow, David J. Scow. But if you would like to get that conversation ahead of the crowd, if indeed you would like every episode ahead of the crowd, then become our patron at patreon.com/thisishorror. Not only do you get early bird access to each and every episode, but you can submit questions to each and every interviewee. And coming up soon, we will be chatting to the horror and suspense legend Dean Koontz. And we will also be chatting to two of my favorite screenwriters, two of my favorite filmmakers, Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead. So if you have a question for Dean, Justin, or Aaron, then do consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thisishorror. Okay, before I wrap up, a quick advert break.
It was as if the video had unzipped my skin, slunk inside my tapered flesh, and become one with me.
From the creator of This Is Horror comes a new nightmare for the digital age, The Girl in the Video by Michael David Wilson. After a teacher receives a weirdly arousing video, his life descends into paranoia and obsession. More videos follow, each containing information no stranger could possibly know. But who's sending them, and what do they want? The answers may destroy everything and everyone he loves. The Girl in the Video is The Ring meets Fatal Attraction for the iPhone generation. Available now in paperback, ebook, and audio. From the host of This Is Horror podcast comes a dark thriller of obsession, paranoia, and voyeurism. After relocating to a small coastal town, Brian discovers a hole that gazes into his neighbor's bedroom. Every night she dances and he peeps. Same song, same time, same wild and mesmerizing dance. But soon Brian suspects he's not the only one watching, and she's not the only one being watched. Their watching is The Wicker Man meets Body Double with a splash of Suspiria. They're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella is available from thisishorror.co.uk, Amazon, and wherever good books are sold.
Now, as always, I would like to end with a quote. And earlier this week, one of my dear friends shared a quote with me from the Persian poet Hafez. And apologies if I'm butchering that pronunciation. But the quote is so beautiful and pure that I wanted to share it with you. So here it is. Ever since happiness heard your name, it has been running through the streets, trying to find you. Spectacular. I'll see you in the next episode with splatterpunk legend and founder David J. Scow. But until then, I wish you a very happy new year. So please, as always, take care of yourselves, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.